Yes, join.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, it works. That's all we wanted to see.
We see Rebbe, but he's frowning.
Okay, it works.
Nice to have you here for the review of Pinhas Tafshin Ayin Hay with all of the wonderful help from the House of Gabi, together with Sir Ari Lichtenstein right here. We should have a camera. Nachliel Selavan, Gabi Yankelovich, all the way from South Africa. I'm joking. Okay, so let us begin. Let me have my Chumash, please, if you don't mind. Thank you very much. So, let's see, we have testing. Yes. We have arrived basically at the moment, which is essentially the end. The reason I say it's essentially the end is because here is the place we've already completed the transition to Moshe Rabbeinu, who has learned the
It's 20 hours.
of his requirement to be Devarim, in which he's trying to be the second mistake that was made of being unable to speak to that rock. And of course, in this week's parsha, Moshe Rabbeinu is told that all you need to do is one little tidying up effort, which is the Nikom Nikmas Yisrael from Midian, and that's it. Then it's time for you to leave. Hashem Beitavon Achicha, with the entire, once again, the mentioning of the Moyamantan beef, idea of not speaking to that rock, so that really the things that happen here are the things that are reviewed in the last psuk of the Torah, and that is the relationship with Moshe and Bilam. Obviously, this closure, the murder of Bilam in this week's parsha by Pinhas, that the next week's parsha becomes so important, together with the events of next week's parsha, which we'll see have to do with the Geula, coming of the end of the entire period of the Midbar, which begins here with Yerusha of Eretz Yisrael, the Kida of the Ocean of Eretz Yisrael, with Benot Slavcha, and continues on next week with the continued discussion of the elements of the Yerusha, then closes basically with ideas that we'll see are very Nagea Yerusha Saretz, and the story of Benot Slavcha, which is fundamentally part of the Yerusha, as I'll be maskir soon, and which then appears to be nothing but a brief review of the Masos of the Midbar, the 42 Masos, which are connected to various developments, as Rashi tells us, of that process, of that journey. And then we have the brief review of Moshe Rabbeinu, 36 days, in which he closes with his vision of what really happened to us during all of this time. And then we get back to this week's parsha, in which we talk about the Nevias of Moshe, Nevias of Bilam, and the way that this relates to the Shviras HaLuchos into this period, and the Elei Kol Yisrael, which was the Shviras HaLuchos, and now we are somehow on our way. Which means that the story of Pinhas, which is the events of Pinhas that take place in contrast to Bilam's last message to Balak of, okay, so let me give you an idea, which we take to mean very much like the Saruman idea in Lord of the Rings. You can still do a little bit of mischief, so even though I'm no longer a Navi, but I've got a good idea for you to do a little bit of mischief. So I've spoken to you about Mashiach and what it is that this Am is going to be doing. You better head this off. I've got some good ideas. Now he was bold. He told Schar Esrim V'Arba Elef. Okay, fine. Man, it sounds like a little bit of a stretch and do a little bit of damage. I want to collect at least a little bit of all those Malo bites of Kesed Azov that I was hoping to get. But we'll get Scarf Esrim Arbel. That's how we look at it. Now, obviously, if this is really the parsha, which concludes Kol HaTorah essentially, in the sense that Moshe Rabbeinu is now told, just has to close this one parsha and everything will be fine. And then Neikim Nikmas Hashem, Nikmas Yisrael. Then something very fundamental has to happen over here that allows that to happen. In other words, somehow or other, the linkage to Pinchas's act, and to Pinchas's kanos, which HaKadosh Baruch Hu here spends the entire parsha, as we'll see, telling us why it was a good thing and how it fits into what Klal Yisrael is, and then the sending of Pinchas to actually do that Mekayim Mikmas, that means that Pinchas is central to that transition, so that the relationship to Pinchas and Yoshua, the appointing of Yoshua, which occurs here, the fact that Pinchas is so active in the Knisa La'aretz and the way in which he deals again with the same issues that were brought up just now with Bnei Gad, Bnei Reuven, he becomes the one that goes and then has to find them their place and give them their cancel the civil war that was going to take place, and the way that he comes up to translate, as we've spoken about in the past, the story of Bilam, which is Min HaShitim LaGilgal L'man Das Tzidkes Hashem. He has to go Min HaGilgal El HaBochim in order to complete that story, which is the end of the story of Vayhem HaBochim that we just had in the Parsha, which means that he's dealing with something that Moshe Rabbeinu wasn't able to deal with. As we saw, Moshe Rabbeinu is approached by Pinchas himself, who says, "My dear uncle, Achi Abba, did you tell us that can I beg him by?" And all that Moshe Rabbeinu can say is, "Gayana di Garta, Hielaki Parvanka." So he gives him, so to speak. He doesn't say anything because he can't. If somebody's mom with him doesn't, you're not allowed to tell him to do it. He just wants to be in his correct markham. And now we have the parsha that describes that. We don't usually see, when we read the parsha, something that is so extraordinary that it should provide for the entire future, that it should provide for the transition from Moshe to Yoshua, that it should provide for the closure of the Midbar years and the opening of the actual Yerushas Haaretz. We just don't see it that way. And yet, clearly, the Torah is being Me'idah. That's exactly the way we should see it, which means that what really happens, just as we thought it was a small issue, the contrast of the Nevi'as of Bilam and the Nevi'as of Moshe, I thought it was a small issue. It's not a small issue. It's the whole meaning of Vayikra, the contrast of the Vayikar and Vayikra, the Aleph. It's the whole meaning of the Mishkan. It's the whole meaning of Bamai Yivadai, Fokin Flino Ani V'Amcha. It's the whole basis of Moshe Rabbeinu's Barkosha, Shlokish Roshina, under the Yom. And this idea of Niflinu Ani V'Amcha, that Pele itself has got to be part of the Pele of this transition. And that calls upon us to reevaluate not only what it was that Bilam was doing, which must have been a lot more effective if you believe that it could maybe even stave off Mashiach. Because here's what's going to happen to you, so you better do something that's going to make this not happen. He thought, and perhaps if it hadn't been for Pinchas, it would have been right, but he thought that what he was going to do was going to be enough to create the equivalent disaster that would have happened if he would have been able to be Makal Yisrael. Again, it doesn't seem to us that it was that much of a major threat, and that Pinchas's offsetting of this threat was something that was so major that it changes history. And yet, we're told that Kedai Kapara Zul Chaper until the end of history. This is basically the Chipar B'nai Yisrael. It's not just a one-time event. This is the Kapara B'nai Yisrael. This is what makes the future of Israel possible. And if that's the case, it's important to reevaluate what's happening here. What we clearly see, if we try to understand how the Parsha relates to elements that are actually part of the entire story of Bereshit, is that the Parsha is an expression within the nature of the world of two completely different elements of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Hanhaga. These elements were fundamental to Moshe Rabbeinu and to Bilam because we know that the Chazal tell us that there were certain things that Moshe was greater than Bilam, and certain things that Bilam was greater than Moshe. One of the things that Bilam was greater than Moshe was that he was V'yodei Das Eliyah. Whereas Moshe Rabbeinu requests Hudiyas Drachech, the very thing that Bilam claims to know, which again we take as a joke when we claim to know. The Gemara says if you're das the Yada. So all he knew was that rega. So obviously that rega, which again we take to mean okay, it's basically a game of something. Something is so deep, is so real that I don't know who's talking there in the background, but then I didn't realize we were working in both directions here from the Google thing. I'm sorry. I did it myself because Ira wasn't. Okay, it's muted. All right. I don't know who he is, but it looks like a very funny cartoon. Thanks. Sorry for muting. It's completely different. I know because I couldn't ask Ira to make the links. I just sort of made it myself, so everybody's coming on in a different way. Maybe it's better because I get to see it and everything. But in any event, there are two completely different anhagas, and remarkably, this parsha seems to parallel those two different anhagas within the structure of our own experience of life, which is something that we've never seen before. We know that in the Bakash Vadini Nasrachak, we have a machlokas in the Gemara. Did HaKadosh Baruch Hu answer him? Is it l'chanotiyat asher achon? Is that somehow different? I'm not answering your question. Or was HaKadosh Baruch Hu answered him also on this one? Which the complexity relationship between this Bakasha and the Areni Nask Vaydecha, and Moshe Rabbeinu was taking this to mean Vayechu Hashemayim Va'aretz, the interrelationship of all elements of my separations. However, we understand that, and we'll see that it's very relevant. However, we understand that we know, as the Ramchal explains in his own language, there are two completely different modalities in which the world develops through the Anhagas Hashem. One of them he calls Anhagas HaMishpat, which Kabbalistically is better known as Zeir Anpin. And it's the way that we're used to with the Midas Hayom of understanding HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Anhaga in the world, the development of the organism of the world, development of psychology, and so on. And these are things that make a great deal of sense. But we also understand that they're liable to fail. They don't have any intrinsic guarantee of success. They're just the way that things develop themselves. HaKadosh Baruch Hu could destroy everything with Anhagas HaMishpat. He tells Moshe Rabbeinu indeed after the Luchas, let me wipe everybody out. We'll start all over again. And so it's actually the request of Moshe Rabbeinu to be a different level of Anhaga. And that different level of Anhaga is, in terms of the words, the Ramchal, the way he calls it, it's Anhagas HaYichud. Anhagas HaYichud being the way in which ultimately the world is meant to succeed in the Achna'ah of Ra, I mean recognition that becomes clear that all things are direct derivation of Yichud Hashem and His Teva and Bria, and that Ra becomes only a kli that is used in order to allow the world to become itself. And that is called, Kabbalistically, that's called makifi, in which things are arranged so that they work out in particular ways, which comes to the fore really very much through Bilam, the carry of Bilam, which becomes the carry of Purim, which becomes the Makom Acher. It's coming from somewhere else. It's coming from out of left field, as we would say in English, in which somehow or other the wildest things happen, and even though you would think that it wasn't going to work out, boom, as happens very often, even in our own lives, somehow out of left field things do work out. The beginning of this left field is the actual description of Mashiach, which is the Zera Acher. So it's also Zera Acher is a reference indeed to Ruth. This is Zera that's coming out of left field. The last place where you would expect to find David and Matzos and David Abdi, and that's in Sidon. And it turns out that Shet, the whole binyan of the Yolam, is a binyan that ends up referring to Moshe Rabbeinu and the change from Cain. So this becomes Moshe's taking the place of Hevel, which is Moshe, Shet, Hevel, Mem Shenei, becomes the nature of Moshe himself. Somehow this kind of thing is there to assure what we call the Anhagas HaYichud, in which somehow the Nister becomes so much part. If you don't mind muting yourself, nice to see you. The Anhagas HaYichud becomes Nister. It's something which is hidden within the reality of what Bria is, so that there's no way, as Mordechai says to Esther, there is no way that Mokom Acher, which is there's Zera Acher, Mokom Acher, Minas is Acher, and so on and so forth. All of this is ultimately guaranteed to somehow be part of a vision that asserts itself. However one wants to understand the way that that's achieved, it's clearly not mechanistic at all. Adarabba, it's because of that it's part of the transition from the world of mechanics of Moshe Rabbeinu is hitting the rock to Moshe Rabbeinu is speaking, so that it's very much part of Dibur, the Dibur of the Elah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Dibur to the Elah, and the way that all of that has changed in this parsha, where for the first time Moshe Rabbeinu speaks to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, like Abraham Moshe Rabbeinu instead. Chazal say this is the first time of all the parshas of the Torah that we suddenly get to this dialogue. There's something fundamental that's changed. The reason that I say that this is expressed so much in the parsha is because, amazingly, the parsha forces us to recognize that the Torah is insisting on an understanding of our experiences on precisely these two levels, such that the things that occur in the parsha also occur on these two levels. So we have over here, at the simple level, we're taking a story of a census. In the middle of the census, as we've done, this very old shirim, I think that was even written in the Frameworks essay, the difference between extraordinary individuals that show up in the description of this history. Somebody hasn't muted, so please look at yourself and do. It's someone who has a picture that appears to be some houses and water, doesn't have a name, but whoever you are, do me a favor, mute yourself. And we'd love to know who you are. You know what, I can do that too. Oh, you don't have to. I can actually close my phone. Right, I hope it doesn't affect you. If anybody's got a problem? No, it's still good. Okay, so we have two levels of descriptions of history. And those two levels describe what... I can't take it, wherever it is, I'm just going to turn them off because I can't. It's Chaim Meisel, and that's what it is. You're driving me nuts. I'm gonna throw you out if it doesn't stop. So, I don't know how to get back down. Hello.
We're talking about the extraordinary individuals in the census.
Yeah. So we have these injections of very strange descriptions of people that failed or that succeeded. We have to know about them in the middle of describing the number of people in a particular shape, in a particular mishpacha. So we need to know about Dosan Lavira, we need to know about Korach, we need to know about Nadabavu, and so on and so forth, as if they're actually part of, thank you, they're actually part of the story of somehow the development of the day-to-day things which nobody else registers. Well, we have the story of all the people who don't register, and then a few people who do register. Ideas of the extraordinary individuals there as part of a punctuated development of things, so to speak, on one end, and then the day-to-day things that happen. And then obviously it's recognized as being part of the development of human history overall, that we have these seminal moments, seminal people, and issues that seem somehow to congregate around tipping points that sometimes can be focused even on an event or on an individual. We also have, basically, the descriptions of completely different ways of experiencing also ultimately our Masa'ot, our Machane, completely different ways of experiencing what you would think is just a matter of reproductive success. How many people do you have? Let's count the people. But instead it turns out that the whole purpose of the Parsha is to show that there's a tremendous difference between the fact that you are as an individual and the DNA information that gave rise to you as an individual and its integrity. Now, its integrity is the whole idea of the Parsha, because as we've seen, the tinus against Pinhas has nothing to do with whether what he did was right or wrong. It has to do with whether he was the one that was supposed to do it, which of course ties into the nature of these different individuals that we were speaking of. so that even though Sanhedrin had rejected him, even though Bezdin had, and even though the Malachi Asharis would be Shulif Goabo and so on, as we've seen, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, you are wrong in your assessment of who he is. And in terms of his yichus, I am personally being a Yachisim, as Pinhas ben Elazar ben Aaron, and so to speak, the Meshiv Chema, Ben Meshiv Chema, Kanoi, Ben Kanoi, and so on. Right? And that funny idea of the yichus being more important than the fact is the idea of the entire parsha, because the immediate census that follows is a census that seeks less to establish how many people there are than to establish that those people who are we think they are who we think they are. Because of that, in this census, we have specifically the Shemes Hashem, as Rashi points out, because the Umay Sa'elam were doing to Yisrael what Yisrael was doing to Pinchas. Who is this guy who thinks he has the right to... who are these people who claim that they're, the children of Avram, and so on, It's basically the same way that the Mitzrim, if the Mitzrim were showered on their bodies, obviously they were showered on their women, and they're all, the children of Mitzrim, and they think that they're Jews. Comes on the Shekhinah to be meyachis with Yosef Hashem, which was precisely what was done for Pinchas by Yosef Hashem, so to speak, the Eidos of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, directly, which becomes the essence of his Bris Shalom, the turning him into a Kohen, making him shaykh to Aveda. This crazy idea of yichus and DNA information is so important that even though the Gemara says elsewhere that Ein Cheshin L'Zera'av when it comes to behemoths, so we don't care if there's mixed genes in terms of many and many of the dinim of behemoths. But when it comes to this version, and it says that there has to be a set, the echad means it has to be seyus from Sheshis Bebereshis to today. It couldn't have any mixed genes. What is the Nogea the Parshias of the Korbanos of Pinhas? That is absolutely crazy. It's a hot to talk about the animals need to be miyuchasim in order for you to be able to use them for these korbanos. It's absolutely wild. So that means that there's two levels. There's who you are, but who you are in terms of the flow of the information of history, in terms of the entirety of Maaseh Bereshis, essentially. That's the Lashon of the word. Seyos all the way back to Sheshis and Bereshis. So, if that's the case, then again, talking about two completely different visions. Locally, how many people are there? How many organisms are there that reflect, the members of the shape? But on the other hand, the question of how are they linked in the nature of the history of Yisrael? Now, this itself is part of the deeper idea in which the Parsha links through the Tviyah of the Notes Lofchad, in which the Parsha links the history. Who Bechatov made? Was he a part of the Meraglim? Was he a part of Karapat Aseh? Was he Tzlofchad? Was he the Mekoshesh? And so on and so forth. Was Stoffel the Mekoshesh? Was he part of the Ma'apilim? So the story of the events that happened become Nogea the question of a deeper sense of identity that permeates the Parsha. That deeper sense of identity is, as the Gemara brings, Rashi brings, that the Taina of Benot Tzlofchad is specifically the question of whether their mother requires Yibum after the death of their father. Because they Taina, if we're considered to be Zerah, so then we should be Yorish. If we're not considered to be Zerah, why is there no Yibum? Now, this is a very profound time that we have because it gets to the other undercurrent. That undercurrent is remarkably that Pinchas' achievement is so profound that the Bris Shalom that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives him is sufficient to completely redefine the nature of the Mashiach that we discovered only through Bilam. So Bilam was giving us the, as we saw last week, as the Rambam brings all of the Inyanim Mashiach come from Bilam. And now we have Pinchas being turned into the Eliyahu, who is the Eliyahu, who is the Malach HaBris, who becomes, as the Targum says, the Malacha Kayama was going to be Machris, the Geula Liatid Lavo. And that becomes the Eshiv Levavot, Avadim, Levanim Alavotam, and so much part of what we do when we talk about Geula, what we think about when we talk about Geula, is linked to Eliyahu Hanavi, which the Rambam also brings as part of the Masorah that we have about the nature of Geula. Obviously, going from Bilam, the defeat of Bilam, the murder of Bilam by Pinhas, to this transition is not a coincidence. It's the same way that we're contrasting the Bilam Moshe vision of what reality is. We're contrasting the Bilam Pinchas vision of what is Malchus Mashiach, what is it meant to achieve and how is it achieved. So that when Pinchas himself becomes Eliyahu Hanavi, we're talking about a new concept which is identities that are meta identities as opposed to local identities. In the same way that we're talking about the presence of an organism that also has to be placed in a meta history of the story of Bria and the development of its information, in the same way that the Seh has to be placed, and in a deep sense, in the way that Yerusha has to be placed. So whereas for the vision of Bilam, in fact, the vision of the Umas Elam, Yerusha is nothing but the latest usage of money that was left over by grandpa, by dad, whatever it is, Okay, now it's mine. In terms of Klal Yisrael, it is viewed entirely in the opposite way. Yerusha is viewed as being meaningful in terms of its end, not in terms of its local. Its local is almost accidental. Now it happens to be mine until I give it to my children, and so on. But it won't be theirs either. Because the entire way in which we define, as the Sifri says, the Yerusha here, is that the Meitim are Yorshim et HaChayim. Then the Chayim are Chozrim, that's Rashi Shita, they're Yorish the Meitim. So we have to first define the number of people that's going to be split between them, go back, give it to the Shevet, and then split it. And it's really wild. And that's the Lashon. Which is, of course, exactly the Lashon. There's a completely different view of what Yerusha is. Yerusha is seen not as the simple financial issues now, but it's seen as the idea of this is mine because it's going somewhere, which of course becomes Shemitah and Yovel, and the idea of Nachala, and my inability to get rid of my Nachala. There's a whole different sense of what Nachala means and what Yerusha means, very similar to the difference between the presence of the individual in the context of the development of my separations. It's exactly the same type of thing, which is the difference between individuals, part of the overall growth of population, and the remarkable centers in which there's some type of punctuated moment which we identify as change. This has everything to do with what becomes, in the end, the story of Maseh, in which we talk about the years in which we might have been Yoshim in a particular place, but it's identified in terms of its Maseh, not in terms of its Machana. So its Machana is its stasis, its Maseh is the moment of its change. We go over all of these moments, as Rashi says, comparing them to a father who was taking a sick child, remember here we had to run to the emergency room, remember here your fever broke its arm. Why do somebody want to remember that? Those are not very pleasant memories, and many of the events that took place in the Machanes that forced us to leave were horrific events. And yet we see them as part of the punctuation of that which allowed the end of the Midbar and brought us ultimately to Eretz Yisrael. That's the same two levels. And there's another surprising two levels. But before I say that, remember, we were talking about Benot Tzlafchad. So that means that Benot Tzlafchad, in understanding that their insistence of Yerusha is linked to the question of their father's ongoing identity, which is the nature of Yibum, is very important. Because in the end, remember that Geula itself is achieved Mimokom Acher through precisely that assumption, which Boaz makes, and that nobody has the guts to argue about. If you're going to be Goel a Sada, then you're going to be Goel a Nefesh. The only thing that you can do with that Sada, it's not about money, man. It's about you're taking this woman. No, I don't mean taking her. I mean, taking her to bed. I mean, taking her and making her wife. Don't give me any of this stuff. It's yes or no. Then I can't handle it. I mean, it doesn't say, what, are you crazy? You're a pervert. Let me just do the mitzvah therapy. Girl is on it. Nobody says that thing. Right? They understand it's obvious that the Taina B'not Tzlofcha, that Yibum and Yerusha are fundamentally interrelated. Well, obviously that's true. In pointing it out and telling me it's possible to rebuild the Nefesh HaMeit in his Makom and on his property, I realize that I'm really not prepared to act on that level. This is Ploni Harmony. But identity, which is the whole essence of this question, is prepared to act on that level. And indeed, as HaKadosh Baruch Hu is masking, Kein B'not Tzlofcha Davrot, they're 100% correct. This 100% correct is reflected in an entire crazy parsha of meta identities, in which, as the Shach points out in his Pirush on the Torah, all of this is only shayach to Yisrael, because essentially Yisrael are the only people that are connected to the concept of Gilgul and Ibud, which I'll explain in a moment as we get to discuss some of these strange things. But this little bit of mischief that Mr. Saruman Bilam wants to play, and by the way, Saruman is actually Bilam in terms of the Lord of the Ring, you know that. Yeah, because Saruman the White is Lavan, who is Bilam ben Be'or, who is Kushan Mishatayim. That's why it's called Saruman, because it was Sarum Min HaDerech, which he originally had been committed to being, as he says, Yodea Da'asel Yain, I only went to the Ratzon Hashem, and so on and so forth. And in the end is exposed as all along being this multicolored manipulator with his voice. And that's the one thing that he uses, even after he loses all of his power, his voice remains daunting, and that's the Keichet B'Peh.
He gets killed by a cherub too.
What's that?
He gets killed by a cherub too.
Yeah, it's the same amazing story. And it's clear that this is what he's meant to do. So that's why I was comparing this a little bit of mischief, which in the end he's capable of, is not just a little bit of mischief. Because the truth is, as the Medrash points out, the problem that Bilam was coming to address was the nature of Kabbalah Satire itself. Because originally, remember, we lose because of this is why these parshas come here, the Shviras HaLuchos. We basically lose what appears to be the rights that we had to the Nesinas HaTorah being unique, because we couldn't handle the Nasa V'Nishma. It was the question of Kafalei Marchagigis, which was the time of the Unites. Klum Kafit Aleinu Harchagigis. HaKadosh Baruch Hu's answer in the Medrash, so how come they get preferential treatment? HaKadosh Baruch Hu's answer in the Medrash is, okay, fine. Bring me your Sefer Yuchsin. Oh, we don't have Sefer Yuchsin. Well, then you can't expect for me to be able to talk to you. Sounds crazy how the Sefer cares Sefer Yuchsin. Obviously, the response here of what it is that Bilam is doing, as the Medrash points out, Kivan Shabbat Bilam, and Yitchilu Liznot, B'not Moab, B'not Midyan. So those very same Ummah said, now they're exactly like us. So it's all over the place. Nobody knows who impregnated who. It's great. That's exactly what we were hoping for. Now we're coming back to destroying the Niflino. So that means he knew exactly what he was doing. He understood that he needed to counter that Niflino that had just been achieved by his admitting Matovo Alecha Yaakov, that Hini Alech Rabbi, that I'm no longer Novi, that Shalot Shoshina B'Nevi'ei U'Mesoreva, and all of a sudden he's got a simple answer. If we can just create the Andalamusia of the destruction of Yichus, then there is no Viniflino ultimately. For us to understand what was so important, they have to be able to provide Sefer Yuchsin in order to be Shaykh to Torah. I mean, it sounds to us to be a little bit of crazy. And yet, this idea of the multiple level of identities is so linked to the concept of Yichusim that, again, as the Shach points out, what we're talking about over here is a unique vision of what an individual identity consists of. And again, as we pointed out in the past, in Kabbalistic terms, in the early development of Klal Yisrael, there were the words and the understanding of the mechanisms for these things was very mystical because they didn't have a concept of information, which was very simple, you know. And the yeah, well, I see that in that comment. Uh-huh. I got you, Rabbi Lapin. Caught you cold. Dead on. Yes. This is fun when I get to watch the screen. I usually do it this way all the time. Usually it's facing the other direction. That's in Zoharic terms, you know, you have these things that they call Gilgal, and somebody has somebody else's neshama, you know, and you know, it's all kind of voodoo and so on and so forth. We understand very clearly in our terms, in modern terms, which they had no words for and they had no metaphor for, that in the same way that we understand DNA to be information, that's all, just pure information. It could have been put into printed form. It would take an awful lot of books, but it could be printed form. It could be put onto a transistor. I mean, there's no particular reason it needs to be linked to molecules together, other than the fact that that is an amazing expression of the way the world actually works and is capable of utilizing it. So we understand it's all about information. We also understand that the additional information that's added by the much more complex interactions between the neurons that are created by that DNA, we understand that that information is also just information. We understand it's way off the scale in terms of how much more complex it is. And of course, we don't really have yet enough of the knowledge to be able to download the contents of the neurons of your brains onto a chip and so on. But we understand that, theoretically speaking, such things is possible. And it would not be difficult in the same way that we can snip and put together different pieces of DNA to create Jurassic Park and so on and so forth, which is not silliness. That can actually be done. Not particularly Jurassic Park, because DNA doesn't survive that long. But certainly there's actual work going on now in the reconstruction of mammals, such as mammoth elephants. They're rebuilding, but also they're not real mammoths, but they're snippets of mammoth DNA in the organisms that are alive today, like other elephants and so on. So if you get characteristics of different, fine. You can snip, cut and snip, splice DNA, right? In the same way, in the Zohar's terms, you can splice identities. So that the splicing of these identities, giving someone, which we see very often, we see this strange, weird fact that someone, 4 generations later, the great-grandfather that is walking around with the same swagger, with the same gait, with the same words, with the same, expressions. You think, how the heck did 4 generations later DNA assert itself that this kid is somebody here? Which I could swear that I know him because I knew his great-grandfather. It's unbelievable. Now, how could that be linked? But it's linked on some level, on some basic level. Literally, all of the idiosyncrasies of the person just reoccur. We understand that in terms of identity, we need to take into consideration 2 things. And the way the Zohar puts it is, one is Ibor. Ibor means exactly what it implies: splicing. In other words, we add something to an identity. So, for instance, Pinhas becomes Ubar, so to speak, with the identities of Nadav Avihu at the time that he does what he does. Because of that, says the Zohar, because it was spliced, it wasn't his identity from the beginning, you always need a vehicle to contain a splice. You can't just splice something into someone's current identity. You have to give him an identity that subsumes that splice. This becomes the identity of the Elio, which itself has multiple parts to it, which the Zohar traces. That's why Elio is a Kohen, if you look at him as being Pinchas. It's why Elio is from God, if he's Elio Hadiladi. It's why Elio is from Binyamin, because of the other element that needed to splice aspects of those identities. It's complicated, but the point isn't just about that. is that the entire parsha revolves around these insane kind of relationships. So that we know that Cosby Bas Tzur was actually Dina, Bas Yaakov. We know that the Shmuel ben Suri Shaddai, who becomes Zimri, was Osek in basically being Makarev, that element that had been lost of Dina. We know that Dina had gone out to sleep with Shem ben Hamor initially. That created the nefesh of Reb Chananya ben Tradian, which is why it says Haaretz Rachavat Yadai, which is the remnants to Reb Chananya ben Tradian, and Yosius Rachavat Reb Chananya ben Tradian. We know that the interrelationships that came from there end up becoming, Cosby becomes Ashes to Nistrophus, who marries Rabbi Akiva, which is the 24,000 Talmidim that are killed here, in terms of the 24,000 that die in the Magefa. I mean, even weirder stories, like the story of the Vav of Shalom needing to be Katia in the middle, so it needs to be broken in the middle, and there's a Kabbalah that Vav is supposed to be split into two parts, which becomes in Rabbi Akiva's life an actual Roman by the name of Katia Bar Shalom, in which the guy is being, he defeated Caesar in the Senate, and Caesar wants to get rid of him because he was Mavato, one of the executions of Caesar against the Jews, and so Caesar takes him on. They executed him, and the Matronusa says, Chaval, and the Svina that's going into port, and that's not, can't pay the Mechas, which meant that, how come if you're already being mentioned for Claudius Yisrael, why don't you complete your Gerus? You should have a Bris Milah. And of course, also Remes to a Vav Katia, which is exactly the concept of Yisod that's cut. And so he says, yes, okay, so he goes and he cuts off Yorla, and he says, okay, so I paid the Mechas. Osco comes out inviting Katia Bashol to Olam Haba, and he gives at the last moment, as has been strung up, he says, I'm giving my money to Rabbi Akiva and his Talmidim, which Rabbi Akiva interprets in terms of the Aaron Uvanav to mean Chatzi li, Chatzi to my Talmidim. Right? So this, and there's like a million things over here. Tzlofchot is traced as the Nefesh reviewed of Rabbi Eloi, because Rabbi was once walking and he saw a pirza, and he thought he was supposed to go to the pirza, and then he realized, oh my God, it's Shabbos. And I think if I go to the pirza, of course, would have been his Mekosher Sheitzim, to then go to the pirza. That's Tzlofchot was the Mekosher Sheitzim. And so because of that, a miracle happened, and a tree. What kind of tree do you think it was? A tzlaf, one tzlaf, a tzlaf chal, grows up in that hole, and that miracle happens. Now he gets all this parnasa from that tzlaf chal, and that tzlaf chal, that's the neshama that becomes revealed of Rabbi Eloi, that is misakin, because he shakes him by his Mesiras Nefesh, never time. I mean, there's dozens of these crazy stories, only in this parsha. It's as Pinhas himself has this multiple identity. The parsha is pointing out that the concept of identity, the concept of the individual, is linked to the development of information throughout history. That, as the Shach points out, is only shaykh to Yisrael, which means that the fundamental vision of Yisrael and the way that it differs from the Yisrael, and the reason it's V'niflinu, is due to the reassertion of Pinchas of the centrality of Yehusik, the fact that Kanoim program, which everybody thinks has to do with sex, which has nothing to do with sex, it has to do with Yichus. The raya is that there is no heter of Kanoim program for any type of sexual offense. It's completely irrelevant. Sexual offense. A guy can be sleeping with his mother, can be doing anything at all. Can be doing the most horrific things in the world. It's none of your business. It's a Kanoim program. That is a specific thing in something which might not even be also according to many Shitas. Sleeping with a non-Jew. And again, it's all part of the fundamental vision of Yisrael as to the responsibility for reproduction, which was the initial Bris Milah, which was the commitment to seeing yourself as the arbiters and responsible members of the planet for developing it properly. And therefore, the way in which that vision asserts itself, which I'll discuss in a moment, the way the Zohar puts it is very graphic. The Zohar puts it, the idea that drove Pinchas crazy was only the fact that he sees the oat brit being inserted into a place that is completely alien. And that is unacceptable. So he shoots them through the genitals, so to speak. Because that is the point. He's trying to make that point. These genitals don't go together. It's nothing to do with the sexual offense. There might be a sexual offense. Sleeping with a goya. But the violation is much more profound than any sexual offense because it's a violation of Sefer Yichus. Now, what that means is that by definition, in the same way that the set has to go back to Sheshis Migrations, the idea of being able to have a second tier of identity, one of which we're identifying here as being the equivalent of the Anhagas HaMishpah, which everything seems to be local, everything seems to work out, everybody is happy with their local identity and their local lives and their local money and their local Yerushas and so on and so forth. The difference, however, is that the Sefer Yechusim has to be written. The Sefer Yechusim means that there's material here that is obviously goes outside of your own generation, outside of your own personal knowledge, and it's the Sefer Yechusim that goes all the way back to Adam Arishon, Dor Darshav, Dor Parnosa, and what is shown to Moshe again at the end. We had the idea of Moshe must have seen this before. We brought a riot before. The Medrash brings a riot before. And it's mentioned once again in the Medrash here that this HaKadosh Baruch Hu shows Moshe at the end of this parsha. So there has to be this awareness of something new. That something new requires an understanding that the world is going somewhere. That world going somewhere is by definition Hanagas HaYichud. If there's no specific future, then it makes no difference. Everybody knows the world's going somewhere. It just makes no difference where it's going. So the point is that, okay, fine. Obviously, I don't think I'm going to live forever. I understand the money that I have, I'll pass on to the children I hope to have, and so on and so forth. But that has nothing to do with the vision of Yisrael, which you're taking responsibility for Yibum, for identity, for the future. That becomes the nature of Geula. I'm not saying Geula Sada, but Geula, total Geula of the Elah, which becomes Rus and Boaz and everything that's going on. Zimri himself thought that that's what he was doing. Because his involvement as Shmuel ben Zerushaddai is the Briti Shalom Shmuel. He thought that he was being Makarev, Cosby, who was head of Midian. I mean, this is, for heaven's sakes, this is exactly what Boaz was doing. And this idiot, Pinhas, he comes, finds Boaz and Ruth sleeping together and developing Mashiach, and he shoots them. I mean, can you imagine? Madman, a crazy religious idiot, and not. This is exactly what the Shvatim held. This is exactly what the Malach Sharis held. And until HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes and points out the only issue is somehow Yichusim. Why is that an issue? Unless, of course, that vision of a world going somewhere, which has to be linked back to Seyus V'Sheshes Yimei Bereshis, even in terms of animals, is linked to the nature of the development of the information of Bishvil Yisrael Shenikra Reishis in terms of its end. In other words, the development of the Anagas HaYichud, or of the Makifim, in terms of Maisa Bereshis, are not local. And the ultimate sense of not local is brought out if you consider all the development of humanity is always, as we pointed out so many times, is the escape from the local. In other words, the assumptions that are always local assumptions, that everything revolves around you, and that everything revolves around the way that you do things today, and that everything revolves around the earth and the sky and the stars, and it's all revolving around God's goodness to some bipeds on a little rock somewhere, and the entire universe was created for their benefit, and it's all there in order to make them happy so that they can have pretty butterflies and nice little birdies to have something to sing about, and all of the things that the Rambam makes fun of in the Moreh Nevuchim. These idiots believe that the entire cosmos revolves around them, and it's that gradual discovery that nothing revolves around you, and that essentially you appear to be intruders in a small area of a rock somewhere that just manages to support life with the most incredible, fragile hold. The gradual discovery of all of this, which goes hand in hand not only with the discovery of evolution,
Gradually thrown
not only
into
with the
man.
discovery of your place in the universe and the way in which the universe itself has to be selected, and about how many generations of stars have to pass before even the elements are around that you could have possibly developed from it. And all of the recognition of how unspectacular and unspecial your own situation is in the universe has become the way in which you can gradually come to recognize the idea is that you're not your own boss in most things, that your brain isn't what you think it is, that the reality around you has almost nothing in common with what you believe is reality when you see it through the little spectrum that your eyes are sensitive to, and the foolishness of the way that your brain interprets that data and so on, and gradually come to understand that even your conscious awareness of self is only a tiny part of what's going on in your brain, and that 99% of the things that are going on, you're not even aware of how it is and why it is you're being driven to this and driven to that. You don't know anything about it. So that gradual growing awareness of how complex the world really is served entirely by growing out of the local assumption. The difference between a world that has these nodes of punctuated growth in which the individuals that do things are just not doing things the way other people do them. They're not doing things in an accepted manner. Everything is somehow different. And it's difficult for people to accept that difference. This very much comes to a head in Pinhas, in which what are you doing? And who are you to take the responsibility to do it? And all of those ideas are so much part of the entire Sefer Shoftim, the crazy people that come along, including the crazy people that come along immediately from this parsha. Here's the story of Yiftach and that nuttiness and what kind of yarmulke you're wearing or how it is that you say Sibolet or Shibolet or, you get shot if you say Sibolet wrong. And it's just nutty stories. The first thing comes out of my house, my daughter comes out of my house, be damned if I'm going to go to that Pinchas nut to get big. Who does he think he is? I'm the leader of Yisrael. He should come to me, and I'm not going to get a Pesach for my neder, which is why it's called Yiftach, of all crazy things, for the moment that he's born. It's all in terms of this neder, which goes to the entire next parsha, which defines the entire relationship to Bnei Tzlachah, because he is the daughter of exactly the situation in the family of Mocher ben Menashe where they come from. And as the Targum says over there, it's not that his mother was a Zaina, the way that the brothers claim. It's that his mother came from a different Shevet. And they used to think that that was Zuz. I mean, after all, that was so limiting a view that Geula, because everything we're involved in here, is achieved only by people waking up to the fact, on Tu B'Av, that they weren't supposed to believe that that was a meaningful thing. It was just good for its time, which is most of what happens when people start believing that the world as it is somehow definitive of a reality. It's the change, it's the escape from that. It's the escape from through the Ashrei Adam, the Fachet Tamid, which becomes the escape from Tisha B'Av and Churban, that becomes on Tu B'Av the escape from these Nidar, which of course becomes Matas, which becomes the description of the entire relationship between Av, the Bito, and Ben Ish Ishto, which is the entire story of the Banes that are located in the Kromim, and that become part of Yom Kippur, and it's what we do on Yom Kippur, it's why we do on Yom Kippur, which is the Tikkun of the Ma'aseh Shveres Haluchos, and on Yom Kippur as the Tikkun of the Meraglim, the Chavivus of Eretz Yisrael, of Bnei Tzlachah, which is part of what Rashi stresses here, the Tikkun Meraglim has been a beautiful Kliyakar that understands Shlach Lecha Anashim is Shlach Lecha Anashim. Because if you would have asked me, I would have said, Shlach Lecha Nashim. You can't trust Anashim for anything. Amazing. God, he tells me over an amazing story. You got to tell over the story. Now, tell the story. Come on.
Yeah, just I went into a textile factory, and I was greeted by a male guard, and then we went upstairs and saw the boss and talked to him. And then and all his workers that I see are all females, and I said, wow, it's are these the only workers? He says, yes, I don't have any males. The only male I have is the guard that how do you call it, that greeted you. The other 200 employees are all females, all mechanics, all everybody here, it's the females. They come in regularly, they don't miss a day, they're never drunk, they work. For men, are not efficient, so I avoid them.
Over here, the women, that's beautiful. And over here, the women, of course, are the ones that are the Nechavavais, as Rashi points out. All of this relationship through the next parsha is very much the same idea, you'll notice. Nether is local reality. You know deep down it's bull. It has nothing to do with the way things are. It's the way you want them to be, which is why we need to do enter the dark before we start kapara. It's the nature of kapara is to recognize, call nature, it's all nonsense. And that ultimately, it doesn't mean anything what we like things to believe, which is the source of the morale. You'd like things. You'd like things to be the way that they ought to be. You'd like to believe, as Rav Yochanan points out, that the base of English is a given, and that all we need to worry about is whether people might think that a Balmum is your Chayav Misa, if you think about it, and so on and so forth. All of this insanity and not understanding the fundamental issues is all the iskabris of local over real. So that these two different elements are fundamentally part of the escape from pure locality and stage. And to such an extent, what we don't understand is that the Tana Devei points out that HaKadosh Baruch Hu's Taina is remarkably different than we would have thought. We would have thought that the idea over here of giving Eretz Yisrael to Klal Yisrael is part of the beginning of a discovery of truth and the nature of Aveda and the Shlemus of Yisrael and of Torah and so on and so forth. There's an amazing Tana Devei that says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says that, I thought when they were going to come into Eretz Yisrael, there were people in charge, and that they were going to wrap steel around their bodies to work until they managed to go across the country, crisscrossing the country again and again and again, in order to be Malamed Yisrael, to have Derech Eretz. Malamed Yisrael at Derech Eretz. Derech Eretz, all things. And then, Ad Yashvu Yisrael Ba'atzam. Once there would be a Yashvu Yisrael Ba'atzam, you know what would happen? כדי שיתגדל ויתקדש שמו של הקדוש ברוך הוא בעולמות כולם שברא. בסוף העולם ועד סוף. What in the world is that supposed to mean? Well, it's mysterious enough when Kohelet starts talking about Kvahiyu la'olamot shayu lefanenu, and when Chazal tell us about it, but what the Tana Devei is talking about is the ultimate non-locality. The Tana Devei is saying that in the end, the new information, the achievement of what it is that I'm looking to you for, in my separations, B'Shvil Yisrael Shenikra Reishis, as the Yisrael's vision of a completed earth in which the uniqueness is that you have learned Derech Eretz, that is to say, the shleimus of your life and the vision that you have of what it all is about, which of course is what Torah is meant to give you, is expressed in understanding how it is that the evolution of this earth demands this kind of behavior, these kind of experiences, which you know what, are unique in the universe, and they need to be shared with every other world that I've created. Misofo or not so far, because that's what you have to share. And therefore, it's your job to bring this creation to completion. It's that type of completion, which is the vision that allows you to be part of this idea of the yichusim, in terms of information, from the beginning to the end. See Yerusha as being something that is coming from somewhere and going somewhere. And it's only that is the difference between the experience of the Ummahs, who are committed to a local life, even if they understand the non-local situation which they're in. Makes no difference in terms of the actual experience of their own existence. We get back to which is what Bilam is all about. Bilam's reaction to non-locality is to strip himself of any romantic assumptions. That's all. reduce everything to its rega, and everything will be fine. The insertion of all of these ideas, we spoke about last week, the insertion of ideas of love and commitments and the way in which I experience things as being somehow particularly nogea me is a terrible mistake. We're talking about the nature of being, and that's the way we need to coldly experience things, not make the mistake of personalizing them. And that way we are assured against religion, against projections, against Ra, against taking ourselves too seriously. And remarkably, of course, the funny result is that whereas in the parashas leading up to Bilam, we find that Moshe Rabbeinu is completely basur, b'shgagu basar, and that is his meta historic presence, going back all the way to the Mabul, is the only one who we first find out through his brother and sister in their attack on him that he does not have a derech she'adam rotza l'lechet. There is no rotza l'lechet that could possibly be personal. And then we find out through Korach's attack, but there is no particular way that he would have interpreted the Ma'amoritz of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The halacha l'Moshe Sinai is not the same as something that is given for you to analyze. And that's the entire idea we spoke about last week, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, when we talked about what it was that was added in understanding Moshe in terms of Korah. And everything that happens to Moshe, the exact opposite happens with Bilam. The more he attempts to show his honesty, his commitment to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, his completely impersonal take on all things, the more he turns out to be a laughingstock in which everything is always about him. So when it's the iron gold, he thinks he's saying, you could give me all the gold and silver in the world and it wouldn't sway me one bit. See? That's what he's really thinking about. And so on and so forth. Each thing, he becomes literally a laughingstock to everyone around him. So to the nefesh, kavoah, the ayin ra, the rachbus of his needs, the endless thinking about himself is because he has no way of escaping the very evolutionary locale that he's stuck in. Because the stripping away is not the solution, obviously. It leaves him only in one part of the nature of it. Amazing. Well, again, we'll get back to how all of this changes here. So therefore, what it is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is looking for are all of these multiple levels, which is why over here, visions of Mashiach for the first time becomes clear. New sense of Yerusha becomes clear. The nature, you want to talk about the way that you experience this all the time. You sit around on Shabbos. You sit around on Shabbos, you may be sitting outside and watching the birds and watching the trees. And if you're lucky enough to be in a place where you can actually connect to my inspirations and not define your Shabbos by arguing with people in shul. And you have a real Shabbos in which your tefillas are mishabeach HaKadosh Baruch Hu for my separations and everything that is done with his incredible love and care and the rachamim that we sing of about a meir la'aretz and the tuvay and the ways mechadesh and so on and so forth. And you really experience this. So you feel the whole world is singing that song. And then all of a sudden you think, oh, wait a minute, every one of the birds around here that is singing is going through hell. I mean, it's, and I'm looking at all these cute little animals, but all these cute little animals look cute because they are terrified. I mean, they're looking all around because they're expecting to be eaten at any moment. So they're constantly on guard. They're constantly working. They're constantly foraging. They're constantly storing. They're constantly being eaten. They're constantly being threatened. They're constantly trying to provide for their own children that are being eaten. And so on. Thank God, this is an awful world. And all of the development of this world obviously can only come about through these types of awful types of competitions, which is the opposite of the Moshe story. It's the Kayan story. It's a world of kina. It's a world of competitive infighting and so on. And it's all very nice to talk about Shati Elohim Zera Acher. But the bottom line is, your choice is either have oath and get killed or Kayan. So this shade idea, where is it coming from? That this shakli, that becomes root, that becomes zera'achar, that becomes a whole different way of viewing things. And you realize that the things that you experience on Shabbos are only because of Vayachulu Hashemayim V'Haaretz V'Chol Tzvaim. It's in the Vayachulu that you see it. Of course it's true. It isn't true up close. It's only true when I can see the thing in its entirety. The end result is this incredible flow of life in every possible niche, in the shine of every possible color and expression of feather and skin and modes of life and so on. It's unbelievable. So it's true on the local level. I do not see that, but I experience it entirely in the Vayachulu. Very much in the same way that when a person is Oev Yomim Liros Tov, Lashon Hara is not something that's a religious issue. Lashon Hara is the most profound personal experience of that which is destroying the Tova that you want to see in the Bria, and that's why you want to live. You don't want to live in a world of Lashon Hara. In terms of Shabbos, when you talk about Mimtzol Chavtzecha, Midaber Davar, it's because the moment that you're not in that Vayachol, the moment that you're thinking of the Pirza of your Sadek, your Shabbos has disappeared. You're now a Baal Chai that's struggling in the world of Chai, who can no longer see the Vayachol. It's the same element that allows Yisrael to see Shabbos, that allows it to, and this is the reason that's the Matanu Tov Yeshli, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe Rabbeinu on our Sinai. And this becomes the Matnas Chalko of Moshe Rabbeinu himself, because this is his vision of a totality in which the integration of things leads to such an unbelievable flood of Teva, which the part of the Teva is the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu allows the Bria to suffer this way in order to become this way. This is the recognition of how wonderful it is that we say Dayana Emet, and we have to make that bracha of Dayana Emet with the same love that we make the Tov Amitiv. So that there's so much love here that even the fact that competition is created on Yom HaSheni means that HaKadosh Baruch Hu can't bring himself to see Tov on Yom HaSheni. There's no Kitov. Why? Because even though this Machloket was totally L'tzarech HaBriyah, so there's no way for the world to discover itself or engage in this path. Nonetheless, I just can't bring myself to say it's good. I'll wait till the next day. Then I'll mention it's good twice. Because I know it really is good. But how can I be miyached? It's good in my name on such a thing. But it's an incredible presence of Teva in the air. That's the Teva that you sense. And that's the Teva of the difference between just existing on the local level or recognizing the idea of the true meaning of Derech Eretz and the strange interrelationship of the way in which all of these local lives become part of the story of ultimate Yerusha, ultimate Aveda, and ultimate recognition of truth. So when it comes to Pinchas and Bilam, one has got to kill the other. The differences of the reality, the differences of the perception, in which the stripping of all context and the destruction of any belief in a world that is, oh yes, he believes very much in the idea of Mikra, in the cold idea of the fact that in the end things tend to work themselves out and life continues to flourish. That he understands. The sense of any intimacy, of any connectedness, of any joy in that, any love in that, that it's something that is shared and given to you, he has no idea. It's just a fact. So that the consciousness that he achieves, in which he's even capable of hearing existence speak to him, is an existence that speaks with a coldness, which is kar, which is the korcha, which becomes the literal coolness of a moment. It cools off all enthusiasm. The reason is because he does not see, as most people don't, even aware people, a few people who are capable of awareness of being, they do not see that this being is something that is intimately shared with them. It's just a fact. The experience of being as what it is that you are is an experience of profound intimacy that cannot be mistaken for anything but, in emotional terms, love. For a connectedness that makes you, on a totally impersonal level, able to love anything that is part of that. This lies behind the concept of Avas Hashem and so on. But more profoundly, it becomes also the difference between the way that this is achieved. It's achieved here, as we said, V'niflino ani v'amcha. And it's his idea to try to avoid the V'niflino, and to try to reassert that Yisrael is like anybody else, not simply on the lowest level, because their commitment to Bris Milah is not strong enough for them to say, I don't see my future as being with Cosby Basur. I don't see my future as being with Benos Midian or Benos Moab. Because that they can figure out, as Zimri did, ways to justify. But more deeply, because it's not a problem of Bris Milah as much as it is of identity of thought. And this is the V'niflino. It's a breakdown in views. It's a breakdown in a dream. It's a breakdown in the overall sense of where the world was meant to go. It's the breakdown of the Bishvil Yisrael. It's an acceptance that there's no real difference between a vision of Yisrael and a vision of those who are intelligent enough to be competitive with Yisrael in terms of understanding, in terms of science, in terms of the miyachet, the world, and the intimacy is not important. Ultimately, and this is what most modern people believe, look, she'll be MacGyver, and what's the big deal, It's not that there's anything real that we're talking about. That difference is a much deeper sense of identity of Bris, identity of Israel. And that was what it was that Bilam was coming to destroy. Not so much the sexual elements of Bris Milah as we spoke about, but most fundamentally that commitment to a world, a meta world, in which identity is not defined by your ability to smooth things into a local connection, but by a connectedness that has to go back to the beginning. And that's why Sarah Arthur, in terms of roots, is so important in the very beginning of Shais, understanding how that fits in. That difference between Moaviv and Moavis, which is all in terms of sharing, all in terms of the experience of sharing, the deeper elements of evil, as we discussed in roots. And so, remarkably, the Niflino Haniva is linked here to a different Niflino, which is Ishki Afli. It's another that difference of the Ishki Afli that allows an individual to take a local vision of reality and make it binding is only valuable. And this is amazing because there's an ironic story about the nature of neder itself, which brings out how easy it is to make the mistakes of something that is merely a neder and mistaking it for something that is real. The ironic story is the fact that when you read Maseches Nedarim, you notice that something is wrong with it. The Girsos are all screwed up. The language is not the language of Bavli. It's half of it is the language of Yerushalmi. In other words, the words that you always find in the Yerushalmi, you find suddenly appearing in the Darim for some reason. Instead of take, it'll say T-boy, for instance. There's just these little hints that something's wrong. And it says the Rishonim point out, Lashon Nedarim is Mishana. No Rishonim talk about that. For some reason, Lashon Nedarim is Mishana. Now, it turns out that Lashon Nedarim is Mishana for a very special reason. And that was because in a particular generation, and Rabbi Yehuda, there was a tremendous amount of tainus against Nedarim by meaning. And they used that to argue that the Jews do whatever they want with the Torah. Because after all, Hester Nedarim, Who was
Would
one?
be who
Owen. One of the guys. And they used the Taina that the Heter, the Darmas, Parachim Ba'avra, and the Mishnah, and so on and so forth, to say that you see there's no responsibility for what God wants. It's all a question of papal dispensations. They do what they want, and this caused tremendous religious problems and debates and so on. So he was Gozer to stop doing Heter Nadarim and not to learn Nadarim in the yeshiva. They took the second Nadarim out of the Seder HaYeshivas. They stopped for 300 years learning because of this. Well, I mean, that's the way it was. Despite the fact it was no longer an issue, they stopped learning Nadarim to the point where Nadarim survived because of Eretz Yisrael. They didn't have such a thing. And so all the Lashonis became Lashonis of the Yerushalmi. Then, to such an extent that the Rambam has to justify and put down this whole business, and this is absolutely the way it has to be. You're supposed to be Mater Nadarim, and anybody who says otherwise, you have to be Cheshire from Minus, and we have a Kabbalah that we've been Isaac in this for generations, etc., etc., etc.
What's the name? Just
It
so I
comes
have it.
as the Rabbi Yehuda.
Who restored it?
No, he was the one who took it out,
Right, no,
and it was
doesn't-
very effective because
Yeah.
all of that time had stopped.
Who
Well, yeah.
restored the Roman mountain?
Right? So remarkably, the story of Nadarim becomes a commentary on Nadarim. It's just like Benos Slavcha became mistaken for this is the way it was done, which becomes the whole problem of religion Bismanenu. This is the way it was done, which became the problem of Meraglim. This is the way it is, which becomes the Chodesh Asur B'Natara, which becomes the destruction of Pinhas, which becomes the destruction of any attempt to do anything with Torah in a way that makes it effective and that makes Klal Yisrael part of a developing reality that's capable of being shared with the nature of Yisrael across the universe. Instead, removes you from that totality into something that is small and ridiculous and Meraglim oriented, and in the end, of course, destroys the Yichud of Yisrael and this idea of Yichud of Yisrael in precisely the same way. That's why the Lo Uchal of Ploni Almoni is so much part of modern life. Everybody is afraid of doing anything because Lo Uchal. Why? Because of Shchitat Machlokim. Nobody believes in what they're doing, but everybody believes I can't do different. Because everybody else will say that he's doing the wrong thing, since everybody's independent, everybody agreeing that it's the right thing. So it becomes a self-supporting bubble that is destructive of the nature of the identity of Israel. This concept of Kiyafli turns out to be very much the whole idea of Niflino. Niflino means that not just that we should be different, but that the difference is Niflino. In other words, that it is possible to attain, as opposed to feeling always, this contradiction of oneself. And you'll notice that unless you have this type of made-up identity, you see people all the time completely confused by their own behavior. The reason they're completely confused by their own behavior is because they are forced to believe that the nature of their identity is a continuum of local effects. Therefore, what do I do when love dies? How do I square that? Or how can I possibly do teshuvah if I need to say any adam she'asa, when I know that I am? And I know that I would never erase my memories for anything. Wouldn't give away myself. I would be suicidal. So how could that be true? Then what am I supposed to do if I'm the same person? Even if I'm misakin, I'm still the same person. Or the problem of changes in life. Changes in life may mean that someone that you loved 5 years before is someone that you currently hate. So what does this mean? What does this say about everything that took place during that time? You see people running around cutting out their spouse's picture after a divorce. The fact they were married for 30 years and have 10 kids or whatever, doesn't matter, it never happened. You hear even more horrific stories. People went through the Holocaust, lost their entire family, Nazis murdered, come out to get married, they start a new life, and they never let on that they had another life. They pretend it never happened. It's an amazing thing. And only after they die do the children find some indication. It's a hidden box. There's pictures. I mean, this happens all the time, these stories. People are incapable of dealing if they read localized of the confusion of the multiple identities that they have in themselves, the changes that take place all the time, the development of personality that leads to completely different appreciation of the relationship that you have with a child and the relationship that you have with a spouse and so on and so forth. And they're wondering about themselves. Is there something wrong with me? Why don't I feel the way I used to feel? Isn't this supposed to be? And nothing is supposed to be. Basically, a human identity is indeed punctuated. And there's no contradictions in that punctuation. The fact is that those 30 years and 10 children were completely part of a true love experience. You turn around and say, since I'm now divorced, therefore nothing that took place before matters. Since this person is now my enemy, therefore I will not accept the fact that I ever was a partner with him, and so on and so forth. That makes no sense at all, because what you are talking about is a changing response to local conditions which does not affect the totality of the identity that's yours. It's simply what you were engaged in and how you were invested in it and what it meant. There is no need to hang on for the purpose of hanging on any more than you would hang on to a netter. Is this, in fact, the netter that you meant to make? Is this what you wanted to define your life as? And so on and so forth. The unwillingness of Yiftach, whose name is defined by this, to go ahead and to find a Petach, and more importantly, the fact that Pinhas refused to go to him to find a Petach, meant that on some level Pinhas failed. The moment that you have, instead of this amazing sharing that you can have with anyone at all that is part of that meta identity, which is called nifleit, nifla'ata. And this defines love for us in the pasuk. This defines Ava she'inat tluya b'davar. Now, Ava she'inat tluya b'davar is defined in the pasuk as nifla'ata. Why? Because I can't trace its local roots. When something has local roots, when I have an interest, whether it's a sexual interest or some other interest, shared experience, interest, whatever it is, it's an Ava that's tluya b'davar, and therefore there's nothing amazing about it. I understand sex is sex. I'm attracted to you. I think I love you. It's part of an evolutionary game, which I'm supposed to believe I love you so that I'll give my genes to you. So now I understand that's not nifla'ata. But what is nifla'ata? Is a love that has no personal component, in which you cannot see personal gain, sexual attraction, anything except the fact that there's something about the nature of the shared experience of what it means to be Yisrael, what identity means as that, or the sharing of the intimacy of existence itself that connects. The very fact that for the first time Pinchas fails, he does everything right. He becomes the one who addresses Bechia, who addresses the failure of identity, the Hima Bochim, which Moshe Rabbeinu couldn't do. He comes up even to such an extent, as we pointed out in the past, Ami Zecharna Min Ha-Shitim El Ha-Gilgal, which of course is a reference here to Gilgal. The Min Ha-Gilgal El Ha-Bochim, Vayal Ma'ar Hashem Min Ha-Gilgal El Ha-Bochim, is Pinhas. And what he does is he comes and he says, I have a message to you. It says Malach Hashem, and it says, over Midrash, that's Pinchas, the Rashi. Even reads the Parshat of Shah. It's Pinchas. Because this is Pinchas' activity all the time. But this is so much later. That's a difference. Again, because he carries that vision of Geula and Yerusha with him. And he says, I brought you into Eretz Yisrael, and I beg you, don't make any retort with these people, with the locals. You're meant to be something different. And that's what you did. everybody sits down and cries, and they call the place bullshit. This is exactly the reassertion of identity that always comes from you. The recognition of that separation always comes from him. So it's Pinhas. For the first time, there's a personal element. He says, I should go to the Samaritans as Yiftach, idiot. He wants to have to first met her, let him come to. Because of that, he loses his Nevi'as for 200 years. It says, Pinchas ben Elazar HaKohen negid alehem. I don't know, he's just negid alehem. Completely different type of position. Pinchas, Yiftach is totally destroyed. He falls to pieces, literally. His Avorim or Noshrim, he becomes a cancer patient. They bury parts of him with gangrene in one place, parts in another place. It becomes a Vayikaver Ba'arei Gilad. It's horrible. Because of the fact that you take yourself seriously. That destroys Niflat. So the Nifla'ata, which is the Ishkiyafli, the fact that you're able to use language, to be able to transcend two levels of reality, and they don't seem to you to be contradictory at all. You're perfectly capable of inserting yourself with a shlemus, with a love and a commitment to all that can be committed to, and not to what can no longer be committed to, not to what needed to change. There's no fear. There's the Asher Elam HaFachit. I mean, there's the happiness of change and of development. But the moment that you allow any aspect which changes your experience of life, so from the Nifla'ata back to the concern for something which becomes competitive, personalized, everything is lost. This is the real development of Derech Eretz of Israel. What does it mean to be responsible? To be of an earth that can end up with a Vayichon. And this is the Rambam says, is what Moshe Rabbeinu is shown in the end, in which Hashem tells him that there's Makom Iti. That Makom Iti is on the Yadvir Kol Tuvi. That Kol Tuvi is Vayichu Hashem words, Vayalim Kol Sharasat, B'nei Tov Mod. That's Kol Tuvi. It says so the Farish in the Bible, says Rambam. What are you going to argue with? It's the only place that Torah says Kol Tuvi. That means that Moshe Rabbeinu's vision and what allows him now to embark on the 36th-day development of the Dvarim is this. It's the fact that someone has taught Israel that there's no contradictions, but that you must. The difference between me and Shlomiel ben Suri Shaddai is that he's not doing anything within the context of Yichus. Moshe, did you tell us or did you not tell us? When you were it from our Sinai. This is Achi Abba, right? Achi Avi Abba, he says. My great uncle. Did you or did you not say Kanai Begin? Means that what you do it in the context of that Sinai. Do it in the context of that reality. And everything is great. But you can't go out of that context. So you can't take Cosby Bastur because you like Cosby Bastur. Yet you could take Cosby Bastur if you were fighting Midian and she was an Ashes Yifastor. That's absolutely amazing. And as Tosfos points out, this is what goes on in Nechamis Midian Gufa. Because Tosfos says, why we need the Kapor? Nechamis Midian, if you're allowed to take Yifastor. It's the whole reason you're fighting Midian. How could you be allowed to take Yifastor? Right? And his only answer is, maybe you wanted two, and you're only allowed one. This is the difference between Pinchas and the grand moral arbiter of, wow, two instead of one. You can rape one, they can rape two. Then maybe need to bring your kapara. Because we don't understand what it means to be invested correctly in Chukat Mishpat. To us, it's all feelings, but it's not feelings. That's not the same. It isn't feelings. It isn't that you have good ideas. Everybody's good ideas. Bilam has wonderful ideas. Science has fantastic ideas. The West has amazing ideas. But what happens with these ideas? Complete and total self-involvement, dragged to the absolute dregs of what humanity is capable of. with all the most wonderful ideas. And the more wonderful ideas, and the more you're aware of the lack of meaning in the local, the crazier you become. Amazing. The only solution is the concept of a vision of the world going somewhere. A responsibility to the nature of the derech eretz that allows the world to work out. It's believable to us that the minor differences that took place could have led to Pelegish Begiva, which instead required wiping out almost the entire Binyamin and rediscovering the fact that the swearing that nobody's allowed to Binyamin was also born generation, just like B'nai Sofka, which becomes itself part of the celebration of Tu B'Av. These crazy things. All of them interlinked in this weird way in the Chumash, in Tanakh, throughout history, because it's a subtle distinction which nonetheless embodies within our experience of our own lives the nature of two completely different analogies of the world. And those two completely different analogies bind within us the experience of wonder, which is the Mithla Tam, of recognizing that we're involved in things that are so far beyond us that we only have this strange taste and experience of them and have no clue as to where they're coming from. We don't understand. So why are we feeling this love? Why are we feeling this care? Why are we so involved? How in the world did it become translated into a physical world? How do our concepts mean so much to us and yet so linked to the flesh, which is the B'Shigam Basar, Moshe, and so on? We're completely beyond ourselves all the time. But the experience of the intimacy of that connection is such that it leaves no room for doubt that this is what our existence is about. And the moment you lose the sense of amazement in the Pella and the Niflatam, you lose the Viniflinu. Because it's the Viniflinu itself that is that small, tiny difference, such that anything that doesn't share that is experienced by you as being absurdly and childishly local. It can be Michelangelo. It can be Shakespeare. It can be the most amazing cultural developments, scientific discoveries, but it's so unaware. It's so much not part of something real. It's so wrapped up in itself. I'm just not interested. It just doesn't talk to me. It's so much of an iflinu that it reflects entirely the Hein Am Lebadat Yishkan. This is not me. It's not part of my world. It's part of a world of mechanics that are constantly looking for more and more advantages, greater and greater glory, which interests me not in the least. It has nothing to do with my experience of a world that has to achieve itself. In my achievement, I'll take all of that and make it something so beautiful and so real, and something that can be so admired across the universe that they will thank me. But I certainly have no interest in what it is that they're doing. It's an amazing thing. Again, it's so subtle. I understand. So what's the difference? And why can't you take it on its own basis? It doesn't mean anything. I mean, it's a great book. I understand. Can't you read it as a... No. It's not talking about people. It's talking about primates that can think. It's not people. It's not the Yisrael that I know. It's not the planet that I know. It doesn't interest me. It's just an amazing thing. But this is ultimately the manipulative. It's so bound up to your own experience of these anhogas of life that it includes all of the ideas of Rabbi Batzalai. It includes the amazing events that changed the world that nobody was able to accept as a matter of course at the time of Purim, the requirement for the Igeret HaPurim HaSheni, the fact there was so many people that wanted to throw Mordechai out of Sanhedrin, and all of the things that gradually come to be ours that Bilam was experimenting with, but that meant nothing until it was absorbed by Pinhas. So it turns out that Pinhas ben Elazar's appears to be small issue undid what appeared to be Bilam's small issue, made it possible and even necessary for Moshe Rabbeinu to leave. This is what it says here. Okay, now your job is over. Once we arrived at this moment, we are for the first time really and truly the Muvdali, which is what the Sefer Bamidbar is about, that ultimate Havdalah. A Havdalah, which is literally, for the first time we can understand, Bein Ha'or Bein Ha'choshen. It's a different way, in the same way that the Or HaGonos is a different way of appreciating the world. That's the same Lashon, it's under the Eliyot, Misofa L'Matzofa. That's exactly what the nature of the Or HaGonos is. Having that type of experience about the nature of life, learning to deal with people, with family, which is why Bein Av L'Gito and Bein Ish L'Ishto is so built around the experience of Nidarim. You get so involved in this fight and that fight. Anybody who reads Nidarim in the Sefer understands that it's half of it is about spats within the family, which is why Haftarah is so different than Haftarah. And you have to talk to her and say to her, "You sure you really wanted to make this neder?" Of course she'll say, "Of course I'm sure, you idiot." It's fine, I'm canceling the neder. There are all the special dinim in which somebody makes a neder as notaris ishta b'navur, every other Mishnah. But the special halacha, like Lagabi and Amoritz, notaris ishta requires a special din, in which there's no such thing as the standard nidrei onesim or the nidarim that we know you don't really mean, and so on, in which you can be matter without actually going to Chacham. No, why? Well, we don't want you getting into fights with your wife. What kind of crazy takon is that? And what kind of crazy takon is neder in the Torah and Avzul then usually Ishtar? Obviously, that's part of the point. And it reflects on the entire nature of local relationships, which was so bound up in both directions, that the ultimate expression of the parsha, which goes beyond what we want to talk about tonight, but the ultimate expression of the issues of the parsha that's coming up in terms of neder is very, very much part of the way to lead the local life that is part of the anti-Bilam vision, who recognizes in his vision that you need to get away from investment into things that are complications for no reason, that sleeping with donkeys makes much more sense than sleeping with women, because it does, in his view. In other words, we're talking about sex. What's the value of a whole complicated evolutionary process which involves the achila, the etzadas, dibur, and needing to justify and say, "Tell me you love me, darling," and please leave me alone. My donkey makes no demands. It's just what it is. And that experience of rega, we point out, the rega, the sexual rega, is served by behemoth, in which case the cursing, which goes all the way back to the thinking in Gan Eden, and about Kriya Shemais, and about structured reality, he rejects the whole thing. It's not just the Davak B'ishto, there's a fundamental connection between structured thinking, scientific thinking, yichud thinking, and the nature of the way in which you relate, your relationships around the Mazah. Which is why we have this unbelievable pasuk that links Kol Shochavim Ve'imah to Machashefah Lo Techayeh. What possible connection is there between the two? And yet the only record that we have in the Torah of Kol Shochavim Ve'imah is the story of the Machashef. It can't be a coincidence, because that magical thinking is a result of the rejection of the type, and it's a postmodernist rejection of the type of spirituality, love relationships, religions, and so on, that postmodernism also recognizes as being meaningless. It doesn't prove anything about the nature of reality. Everybody believes in it. And this is exactly the Pinhas moment. It closes the Torah, and it is referred to again at the end of the Torah, the tikkun of the Na'inek Yisrael and the Shviras HaLuchos, and the recognition that those two levels are ultimately the relationships between the Luchos Rishonim and the Luchos Achronim, and the Shviras HaLuchos that can only be reconstructed through a very nifla top that allows us to experience both of those levels without concern for the contradictions in our lives. And so, thank you very much for patience and for the. I didn't have Ira, as I say, to make this video properly, but I hope I'll be able to work it out and share it with you. Thank you. I noticed it coming.
Beis Chayenu.
As the Gemara says, let me hear its screams.
Hmm.
Everyone, thank you very much for being here. Bye, Torah.